Welcome again to the live video broadcast from Center for Spiritual Enrichment. Today we will continue listening to God's story. We will be reading from the book of Genesis, and our portion for today is Genesis chapter 34, 35, and 36. My sermon is titled God's Story, Jacob's Vow. Let's recall the vow that Jacob made to the Lord, which is written in Genesis chapter 28, verses 16 through 22. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." There are some important words in this passage. First of all, verse 17 uses the phrase, "the house of God." Jacob says, "I didn't know, but now realize that this is a special place. This is a house of God." In the original, the phrase is Beit Elohim. And then in verse 19, it says that he called the name of that place Bethel. In the original, Beit El, which is a house of God, the same as Beit Elohim, but the name of God is used in singular and not in plural as the first time. There is another phrase that Jacob uses to describe this place. Verse 17 says, "This is the gate of heaven." And he says that because just before that, he saw a ladder connecting to heaven and angels of God ascending and descending, and he saw God himself. So he saw this special connection, the opportunity and the capability to basically travel from earth to heaven. And when I was reading this passage, when getting ready for this sermon, I recalled one of the films that was made. The name is Stargate, which later was turned into a number of sequels. And here's the Stargate. I was able to show one frame from the film, the Stargate, maybe later. This is how the makers of the film envisioned it. There is this round thing which serves as a door, and when you enter it, it becomes a portal to other worlds. So in a matter of seconds, you get transported or teleported, if you wish, to some different galaxy, to another world. And this is what Jacob saw. He says this place is the gate of heaven. This is a special place where you could get connected to God. And after that, he gives his vow. He makes his vow to the Lord. Let's read the book of Genesis chapter 28, verse 22. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. First of all, there will be God's house. When he uses that in the original, it's the phrase Beit Elohim. So the place where God dwells, the place where we serve God. This is the first part of his vow. Now the second has to do with the tenth of what God gives to Jacob. In the version that we used, which is English Standard Version, this is represented as a one-time deal, one act. It says, I will give a full tenth to you. But the tense of the verb in the original is imperfect tense, which means repetitive action. So I will be giving many times. Tithing will become something that I do on a constant basis. Before that, Jacob belonged to his parents' household. He lived with them. But now when he's setting on his own, when he is about to earn something, when he is about to have property and so forth, he gives a vow that if God blesses him of anything that God gives to him, he will be tithing God. That's his vow. Time passes, about 20 years passes by, and then in chapter 31 of Genesis, verses 3 and 13 say, Then the Lord said to Jacob, Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. When appearing to Jacob, God reminds him the vow that he made and the place of that vow. He says, I'm the God of Bethel. This is the literal translation of the original. And he specifically uses the word vow. So when Jacob receives this revelation, it is pretty clear what he needs to do. He needs to go back to where he was born and go to the place where he made the vow and make it real, fulfill his vow. Let's see whether he does that or not. We read in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 7 through 12. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, and mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. In this prayer that Jacob offered to God, he clearly goes back to the episode in Bethel. There are two themes that are evident in his prayer that connect it to his experience at Bethel. First is the fact that he says, I crossed Jordan with only staff in my hand, but now I have become two camps. You have blessed me, he said. And this is something that we read in Genesis chapter 20, verse 28, verse 20. 28:20. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. Obviously, he now testifies about the fact that God did much more. He saved him, he protected him, and he made him very rich. So God did what Jacob was asking and was putting as conditions to fulfill his vow. God fulfilled his part. That's the first connection. Now the second, verse 12 of chapter 32 of Genesis says, but you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. This is a quote or a paraphrase of the promise that God made during that appearance to Jacob in Bethel. We go back to Genesis 28, verses 14 and 15. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So Jacob remembers how it all came about. Jacob remembers his vow very well, and he knows what God promised to him, and he quotes God's words that were spoken to him exactly during God's revelation to him in Bethel. So there is clarity, both in terms of what God wants Jacob to do, and in Jacob's mind as well. He recollects, he remembers, and he recites God's words that were spoken during the episode in Bethel. So, what is a vow? As we have seen, when a person is in distress, when there is some kind of a need, when there is something that's not going the way that the person planned or wanted, when there is fear, when there is some kind of circumstances that are difficult or that seem impossible, a person can ask God to intervene, to protect, to bless, to be, and to deliver. And if God does that, God doesn't have to do that. He is a supreme ruler. He makes a decision whether to accept or not to accept the text of the vow. But if God accepts and does what he is asked to do, then the question is, whether the person would keep his or her end of the bargain. Let's take a look at the biblical account and see if Jacob will go to Bethel and will do what he promised. And we could read about that in Genesis chapter 33, verses 16 and 17. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Souk Wat and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Souk Wat. Sukkot is a plural form of the word, of the Hebrew word sukkah, which means a tent, or as in this translation, a booth. So he made booths for his animals. Therefore, the place was called Sukkot. It doesn't sound like Bethel, does it? Unfortunately, Jacob doesn't go to Bethel after God delivers him from Esau. Let's take a look at the map of that place. You will be looking at the center to the eastern bank of Jordan River. Right there, when this brook, Jabbok Brook, goes into Jordan River, there where Jacob stays. He doesn't cross Jordan. He continues to dwell on the other side of Jordan, on the eastern bank. Moreover, the biblical text tells us he built himself a house, not a tent, as he used to and as he will continue to later in the story, but he builds a house, something that is stationary in its essence. It's a stationary structure, so he plans to dwell there for some prolonged period of time. Many commentators ask the question, why didn't he go to Bethel at once? And many offer this suggestion. His hip was injured after that fight with a night guest, and he was limping after that. Well, let's say he needed time to recover from a hip injury. We'll give him some time and we'll see whether he proceeds to Bethel after that. The account is given to us as follows. Genesis 33, verses 18 through 20. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. Unfortunately, we see that Jacob doesn't go to Bethel even after his hip is healed. And the fact that he purchases real estate signals to us that he plans to stay there for a while. He is not in a hurry to fulfill his vow. And unfortunately, when he tarries, when he stays in this place, rather than fulfilling the words and the promise that he gave to God, he sees difficulties and even tragedies in the life of his family unfolding in his eyes. Let's read the account that's given to us in the book of Genesis, chapter 34, verses 1 through 4. Now, Dena, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dena, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." What happens is really a tragedy. He seized her, verse number 2, lay with her, had sexual intercourse with her, and humiliated her. 3 actions. And later, in verse 7, the Bible says, the sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it. And the men were indignant and very angry because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. Such a thing must not be done. The proper way is to get married first and then enjoy intimacy. In this case, it was vice versa. And many could say, well, it happens to young people. They got carried away and got engaged in this physical activity, which, one thing led to another. And, it so happened. And now what? He proposes. He asks for her hand in marriage. But the Bible gives a very clear characteristic and very clear definition of what happened. Verse 31 of the same chapter 34. But they said, should he treat our sister like a prostitute? So these kinds of free love, so-called, is given a name, a definition. He dealt with her like with the prostitutes. This is not the way to do it. You first get married, then you enjoy sexual life. There is another thing to note. Verse 26 said, they killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dena out of Shechem's house and went away. We learn from this that while he was asking for her hand in marriage, Dena was still kept at his house. So it wasn't the case, as some could assume, that they had this intimacy and then he went away and then later he made a decision to marry her. No, she seized her. He seized her. He violated her and he kept her a prisoner till the time when her brothers came to rescue her. This is a family tragedy. Her innocence was violated. God's will was violated. And Jacob sees all of it with his own eyes. The story proceeds to tell us in verses 24 and 25 the following. And all who went out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and to his son Shechem. And every male was circumcised. And, and all who went out of the gate of his city did so. On the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dena's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it fell secure and killed all the males. The inhabitants of this city, Shechem, they haven't had a prior experience with circumcision, which is physically painful. And it says that while they were sore on the third day, when they were not capable of defending themselves, these two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, they killed all males. And this act is given a very concrete definition and concrete evaluation by the Spirit of God. In the book of Genesis, chapter 49, we read verses 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. They should not have done that. Jacob, when he was dying, before that, he summoned all his children and blessed them. He was filled with the Spirit of God, and he prophesied about their future and future of their descendants. So, being filled with the Spirit of God, acting as God's mouthpiece, as a prophet, he gives a very concrete description of the essence of what took place by Simeon and Levi. They acted in violation of God's will. God could have protected Jacob and his family as he has promised, and they could have received his help. But because Jacob did not hurry to fulfill his vow, because he made a detour, because he went somewhere else rather than to Bethel, he got separated from the blessing of God. If you take a look at the map again, you could see that Shechem is located on the right side of Jordan, on the western banks of Jordan River, approximately at the same level as Souk Wat, but on the opposite side of the river. But it's still far from Bethel. You could find Bethel if you drop your eyesight lower and see there south of Shechem, the place where Jacob was supposed to go, where God was calling him to go. Now, what would God do to Jacob, to his family, to the whole situation that they found themselves in? Let's continue reading Genesis chapter 35, verse 1. God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. God calls Jacob to fulfill his vow. He specifically reminds him that he protected him from Esau. He has been faithful to Jacob. So he says, now, Jacob, go and fulfill what you promised to me. In a classical commentary written by a Rabbi Hirsch, we find these words. The event described in the previous chapter, that is chapter 34, shows that Jacob's presence among the inhabitants of Canaan endangered his family. Probably Jacob should not have settled in close proximity to the Canaanites. First of all, he needed to go to the place where, having left his parental home, he laid the cornerstone of his future. Will Jacob be obedient now? Will he listen to God's will? Verses 2 through 5. Chapter 35 of the book of Genesis tell us. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Finally, Jacob makes a decision to fulfill his vow and to do the will of God. And he is inviting his household and other people with him to join him. And when we read this passage, it's interesting to point out some of the things they had to do and leave behind in order to go and worship God. What is required to serve God? When you look at the passage, you see verse number 2. First of all, get rid of idols. Then cleanse and change your clothing, change clothes. Some of the garments are not acceptable to be worn by the people of God. Some need to take a closer look at what they wear and ask whether this would represent God that they serve. In that case, Jacob tells them, change your garments. And then there is something that they do that Jacob did not ask. Verse number 4 says that they took out earrings from their ears. He did not ask for that, but they do it voluntarily. Why? They understand that holes in a human body definitely were not part of God's original design, except for those holes that God created himself. But when a person violates his body and makes additional needless holes in it, does piercing, and then puts something in there, in the biblical account, this is clearly connected to serving other gods. Jacob says we need to put these God's aside when we want to come and serve the Lord, and they immediately take out their earrings. They understand that this is something that's not appropriate for the people of God to wear. And in reality, when we look at the origin of piercing and the custom of wearing earrings, we find, for example, in Targum Yonatan, one of the oldest commentaries on Torah, earrings were not only jewelry, but also amulets and objects used in the spell. And as soon as they do that, as soon as they free themselves from something that is associated with serving idols, serving other gods, here's what happens. Verse number 5 again. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Before that, in chapter 34, Jacob says, we are not a significant group of people in terms of our size comparing to the nations around. They could easily destroy us, he says in verse 20. But when Jacob makes a decision to serve God and all who are with him, God immediately begins to act. He sends fear to the surrounding nations, and they do not pursue, they do not chase after, they do not harm the people of God. God's protection returns to Jacob. Then we go on, and in this chapter 35 of Genesis, read verses 6 and 7. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Finally, he fulfills his vow. He begins to serve the Lord there in Beit El, in the house of God, at the very place that he made a promise to serve God. And he begins offering sacrifices and so forth. He begins to fulfill his vow. And after that, God appears to Jacob again. Verses 9 through 12. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. It's a very interesting statement. The phrase, no longer shall your name be called Jacob, means that from this point onward, right? But the funny thing is that Jacob was already called Israel. Before that, we read this in chapter 32, verses 27 and 28. The same phrase is used. Verse 28, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. But when we read the whole account between these two revelations of God to Jacob, he is never called Israel. Because Israel means the one who overcomes with the help of God, an overcomer. Jacob has a totally different meaning. Unfortunately, patriarch Jacob lived as Jacob with his old name and not as Israel till he completed, till he fulfilled what he promised and entered into God's blessing again. So this is Jacob's story, Jacob's vow, how he made the vow, how he tarried and waited and was putting it off, and how he finally decided to do his side and to make his promise a reality. Does it have any relevance to us? Are we allowed to make vows to God as well? What does the law of God tell us in regards to vows in our lives? Let's quickly read a couple of passages. The book of Numbers, chapter 30, verse 2. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. This is the Torah. Now, how about apostolic writings, the New Testament writings? We can read in the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 18, that says, after this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. And with him, Priscilla and Aquila at Cenchrea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. As we can see, Apostle Paul, living in the New Testament era, still gave vow to God and kept his vow. These laws of the spiritual world, namely this mechanism of giving vows, securing God's help, and then doing what was promised, was in effect and real before God gave Torah on the Mount Sinai, before the laws of God were written down. We see that the laws of vows were real in the book of Genesis and in the life of Jacob. And as we have just read from the book of Acts, they continue to be valid and active in the New Testament era as well. My sermon today is God's story, Jacob's vow. In difficult times, we can make vows to God. God is not obligated to accept the terms of our vows. He is sovereign. But if he does, if he knows that this will be good for us, and he does his part, please make sure to do your part and fulfill your vows in a timely fashion. May God bless you. Amen.